First time Keith Newton heard the Vrakthar play, he lost 3 men and most of his hearing in his left ear. That was 7 years ago, on a Tuesday, which felt like the wrong day for the world to nearly end. Tuesdays were for paperwork and cold coffee and arguments about the break room microwave. Tuesdays were not for watching a 12-foot alien ape drag a 6-stringed instrument made of bone and crystallized starlight across a stage in the middle of the Nevada desert, then play one chord that turned the air itself into a weapon. He remembered the sound more than anything else. Not sound, really. The word didn't cover it. It was pressure and frequency and something older than either. Something that reached past the eardrum and grabbed the back of the skull and squeezed. 2 of his men had simply sat down in the dust and refused to get up again. Corporal Reyes had walked 12 steps into the desert in a straight line, knelt down, and never stood again. The third, Sergeant Lim, had looked at Keith with an expression of profound apology before the resonance wave hit him full on and stopped his heart like a clock. Keith had survived because he was behind a concrete blast barrier at the time, and because he was, as his commanding officer, Colonel Yusuf Damaris, had once described him, the luckiest unlucky son of a bitch I have ever had the misfortune of keeping alive. He'd spent the next 6 months in a facility outside Albuquerque being told that what he'd witnessed was a classified event, that the creature had retreated after the initial performance, that everything was under control. He'd spent the 6 months after that, drinking himself toward a conclusion he never quite reached. Then, Damaris had called him at 3 in the morning on another Tuesday because the universe had a sense of timing that Keith found personally offensive and told him it was happening again. How far out? Keith had asked, sitting up in the dark. 14 hours. It's not heading for Nevada this time. Where? A pause. Denver. He was on a plane by 4:30. The staging area was a converted warehouse on the western outskirts of the city, surrounded by a perimeter of hastily assembled signal-dampening arrays that the tech specialists kept assuring Keith would work. In the way that people assure you of things when they have no idea whether they're true or not. The arrays were designed to disrupt the Vrakthar's primary sensory apparatus, processed environmental information through a form of echolocation adapted to multiple frequency bands. In theory, the dampeners would blind it. In theory. Keith had spent enough time around theory to know it was mostly decorative. He stood at a folding table with a cup of coffee that had been sitting long enough to develop opinions, looking at the tactical overlay spread across 3 monitors. Around him, 42 soldiers moved with the tight, controlled energy of people who had been briefed on something they would rather not have been briefed on. He recognized some of them. Sergeant First Class Daria Okafor, who had survived Kandahar and 2 tours in places that didn't officially exist. Corporal J1 Shin, 23 years old, and already carrying himself like a man who had learned to calibrate his fear to something he could work with. A dozen others whose names he was still learning. And then there was Noah. Noah was the reason Keith was in charge of this operation instead of someone who actually wanted to be in charge of it. Noah was a former electrical engineer, currently classified as a specialist consultant by the Department of Defense, which was the federal government's way of saying they needed him desperately and had no official box to put him in. He was tall, narrow-shouldered, a slightly unfocused look of a man whose brain was perpetually running 4 problems ahead of his face. He was also, Keith had been informed, the only person alive who had studied recordings of the Vrakthar's instrument long enough to develop a working theory about how it actually functioned. "Walk me through it again," Keith said, when Noah appeared at his elbow with a tablet. "The instrument isn't decorative," Noah said, which was the way he started every explanation, as if people routinely assumed alien weapons were purely aesthetic. "It's the mechanism. Vrakthar don't have projectile technology. They don't have directed energy weapons in any form we recognize. What they have is this." He pulled up a spectrographic analysis on the tablet, a dense thicket of waveforms that looked to Keith like the EKG of something terrified. Resonant frequency manipulation. The guitar, and I'm using that word loosely, it's more of a quantum harmonic transducer, sir, generates interference patterns tuned to the specific resonant frequencies of biological tissue. Human tissue specifically. It's been calibrated. Calibrated, Keith repeated, deliberately. The frequency range was chosen, not discovered. Chosen. Noah looked at him steadily. They've been studying us. The first event wasn't random. Keith set down his coffee. It was a test. A sound check, Noah said. For whatever this is. Damaris materialized from across the room in the way senior officers had of appearing exactly when you least wanted them to. He was 61 years old and moved like a much younger man who had simply decided not to stop. 18 hours has become 8, he said. Something accelerated its approach vector. Why would it? Keith started. We don't know. Damaris looked at the monitors. We also have a complication. There's a crowd. Keith turned. The secondary monitor showed a live feed from a drone hovering over the designated impact zone, a wide flat stretch of parking lot adjacent to an abandoned concert venue on the city's edge, which was where the Vrakthar appeared to be heading, based on trajectory analysis. Or had been 4 hours ago. Now the parking lot and the surrounding streets were filling with people. How did they know? Keith asked. They didn't, Damaris said. There was a music festival scheduled here this weekend. Outdoor, 3,000 confirmed tickets. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone processes something terrible at slightly different speeds. Get them out, Keith said. We're working on a cover story. I don't care about the story. Gas leak, structural failure, whatever you need. Get them out. Keith turned back to the monitors. Noah. If it performs in the open with 3,000 people in range, the resonance radius at full amplitude is approximately 400 meters, Noah said quietly. In an open venue, with the natural acoustics of that space amplifying the low-frequency components, he stopped. There won't be survivors. Keith looked at the parking lot. On the monitor, a group of kids were setting up a tailgate near the venue's entrance. Someone had a small portable speaker playing music he could almost hear through the drone feed. They were laughing about something. He put on his jacket. Let's go to work. The evacuation took 2 hours and was, in the grand tradition of emergency evacuations, messy and partial, and full of people who believed that whatever was happening was definitely not going to affect them personally. Keith spent 40 minutes on the perimeter directing traffic and watching the crowd thin with the grinding patience of a man who had learned that you cannot hurry 3,000 people any more than you can hurry weather. Okafor ran the south entrance with efficient ruthlessness. Shin coordinated the signal teams with the focused calm of someone who had decided the situation was simply a problem to be solved. Problems had solutions. By the time the last civilian buses pulled out, Keith's earpiece was filling with chatter from the early warning array. Contact. Bearing 270 altitude. It's descending. How fast? Fast. The sky to the west changed color, not dramatically, not in the Hollywood way, no wall of fire, no beam of light. Just a quality of the light shifting. The way the air above a road shimmers in summer heat but wrong. Displaced in the vertical instead of the horizontal, like reality pressing inward from a point above. Then the shape resolved. The Vrakthar descended without a vessel. That was the thing that never stopped being disturbing. The casual way it moved through atmosphere. 12 feet of dense muscle and dark fur and eyes like polished copper. The instrument slung across its back by a strap made of something that might have been leather but moved like it was alive. It landed on the empty stage of the concert venue with a sound like a car accident, cracking the boards, and straightened to its full height. It looked out at the empty parking lot. It looked for a long moment. Then it turned its head, slowly, and Keith had the distinct and unscientific sensation that it was looking directly at him behind his concrete barrier 400 meters away. Newton, said Damaris in his ear. It knows we cleared the area. Yeah, it's not going to perform for an empty house. No, Keith agreed. It's not. The Vrakthar reached back and unslung the instrument. It held it at its side, not playing, just holding it, and the air around the stage shimmered slightly as the instrument idled. A subaudible hum that Keith felt in his back teeth and in the old bruise behind his left ear where his hearing had never quite come back. What does it want? Shin's voice, careful and professional. Keith thought about what Noah had said. They've been studying us. The first event wasn't random. It wants an audience, he said. The next 6 hours were a standoff. The Vrakthar didn't move from the stage. It sat at the edge of the platform, instrument across its knees, watching the perimeter with its copper eyes. Twice it plucked a single string. Not a full cord, just a note. Probe. And both times the technicians monitoring the dampening arrays reported significant interference with the signal suppression. The arrays were rated for 15 hours of continuous operation. They were already at 60% capacity. Keith sat in the mobile command unit and ate a cold sandwich and watched the feeds and thought. Noah appeared beside him with 2 cups of fresh coffee, which Keith accepted with the gratitude of a man receiving field medicine. I've been looking at the spectrographic data from the first, Noah said. The Nevada performance. What about it? Frequency range it used. It's not fixed. Noah pulled up the tablet. It modulates, searches almost, like it's tuning to something. Traced a line through the waveform data with his finger. I think the instrument is responsive, adaptive. It adjusts based on feedback from the environment. Keith looked at the waveform. Feedback meaning sound, returning sound. The way a bat navigates, it emits, listens to the return, adjusts. Noah set down his coffee, which means the dampeners aren't just reducing its sensory capability. They're starving it of information. The instrument needs acoustic feedback to calibrate. In the Nevada desert, in open air, it had perfect conditions. Here. He gestured at the array network on the tactical map. We're making it deaf. Is that good or bad? It's good in the sense that it can't fine-tune the frequency to maximum human tissue damage. It's bad in the sense that a creature that's used to navigating by sound and is currently being denied that is going to be very. He paused, agitated. On the monitor, the Vrakthar lifted the instrument and hit a full chord. The dampening array's status indicators went from amber to red across the board. A rise at 40%, someone called. We've got maybe 3 hours before they go dark. Keith stood up. Noah, you said the instrument is adaptive. It responds to sound. Yes. What happens if we give it sound it can't calibrate to? Not silence, the opposite. Noise. Noah looked at him for a moment. Then, something shifted in his expression. The particular expression of an engineer who has just seen a bridge in the distance that he didn't know possible to build. Sonic saturation. If we flood the acoustic environment with enough broadband signal, turn information becomes incoherent. The instrument can't distinguish signal from noise. It can't tune. Can we do that? We'd need significant wattage. Speakers, amplifiers. He stopped. He looked at Keith. There's a staging warehouse 2 blocks east. The festival equipment. 18 speaker stacks rated at 20,000 watts apiece. Keith was already at the door. Shin, he said into his earpiece. I need a forklift operator and 12 volunteers. Tell them we're moving furniture. This up the speaker array while an alien primate watched from 400 meters away was, Keith reflected, the kind of operational experience that didn't really fit anywhere in an after-action report. The Vrakthar watched them work with what he was increasingly reading as curiosity rather than aggression. It tilted its head, played occasional notes that trembled, and made the technicians running cable flinch, and keep running cable anyway. Ofor drove the first forklift herself. She'd grown up on her uncle's farm and could operate a forklift with casual expertise of someone for heavy machinery was simply a fact of life. She moved the speaker stacks into position with precise, unhurried competence, and when the Vrakthar hit a low chord that knocked loose the brackets on one of the rear stacks, she swore quietly in Yoruba and climbed up to resecure them without being asked. Shin was running wire, coordinating the electrical feeds from 3 separate generator trucks. He worked with his tablet in one hand, cross-referencing Noah's calculations, occasionally stopping to recalculate something with the focus of a man diffusing a device he'd never seen before. Which, Keith supposed, was not entirely inaccurate. Keith moved between them, carrying nothing, which was the particular function of commanders in the field. To be present and unobstructed, and available for decisions, which mostly meant standing where people could find you, and trusting that the people around you were better at their specific tasks than you were. This was, in Keith's experience, nearly always true. You didn't survive 7 years in this work by being the best at everything. You survived by knowing who was best at what, and then getting out of their way. How are the arrays? He asked into his earpiece. 2% and dropping, maybe 90 minutes. We need 40. Working on it. He walked to the edge of the speaker array and looked at the stage. The Vrakther looked back. In the late afternoon light, the city skyline behind it, and the cracked boards of the concert stage beneath it, the thing looked almost, not peaceful. That wasn't the word. Settled, like it had arrived somewhere it intended to be. He thought about what Noah had said, a sound check, for whatever this is. It had come here specifically, not to a military installation, not to an empty field. A concert venue, 3,000 tickets sold. It had come to perform for an audience. He didn't know what that meant in any cosmological sense. He wasn't sure he wanted to, but it meant the creature wasn't simply a weapon. Weapons didn't choose venues. Weapons didn't wait. He'd started 3 different thoughts about what that implied when Damaris spoke in his ear. Keith, something's happening. On the feed, the Vrakther had stood. It had lifted the instrument to a performance position, not at its side, not slung over its shoulder. Upright, playing position. Her eyes at 18%, the tech reported, with the flat voice of someone communicating a crisis through professional discipline. They go dark in 40 minutes. Keith turned to Shin. How long until the speakers are live? Shin looked up from his tablet. 30 minutes, maybe 25 if. 25. Go. He walked back toward the stage. It was a very small decision, reaching a certain level of clarity in his mind, and he made it the way he'd made 100 decisions like it over the years. Not with particular drama, not with the sense of a line being crossed, just with the quiet recognition that someone had to, and that someone was him. He walked out from behind the barrier, into the open, into the line of sight of 12 copper-colored eyes. Feel Damaris, starting to say something in his ear, and he reached up and turned off the earpiece. The Vrakther went very still. He walked to a point roughly halfway between the barrier and the stage, not too close, not retreating. He stopped. He put his hands in his pockets, which was something he did when he was trying to appear more relaxed than he was, a habit from a childhood spent navigating situations where appearing relaxed was a survival skill. The creature stared at him. He stared back. In the strange clarity that sometimes came to him in moments of high absurdity, that this was probably the least tactically sound thing he had done in a 7-year career of occasionally tactically unsound decisions. He also had the thought that tactics operated on the assumption that you understood the situation, and that he wasn't sure he understood that situation at all. So perhaps tactical soundness was not the relevant metric. The Vrakther lowered the instrument slightly, not putting it down, adjusting. Keith reached into his jacket pocket and took out the thing he'd been carrying for 7 years, since a Tuesday in Nevada when 3 men didn't make it home. A guitar pick. Sergeant Lim's guitar pick. He'd played in a band before the Army, and he'd kept the pick in his breast pocket, because he was the kind of man who kept things like that. Keith had found it in the dust afterward. He'd kept it because he didn't know what else to do with it. He held it up, not as a gesture of meaning. He wasn't sure it had meaning to the Vrakther, just because it was what he had. The creature's head tilted. Then, slowly it sat back down on the stage. It didn't perform. It waited. Keith turned and walked back to the barrier. His hands were shaking slightly. He considered a reasonable physiological response to the situation and did not take personally. 20 minutes, Shin reported in his earpiece when he plugged back in. Speaker array is almost live. Okay, Keith said. The sound that came out of the array when Shin threw the main switch was, Noah had explained in advance, broadband acoustic saturation signal. Every frequency from 20 to 20,000 Hz at maximum amplitude, randomized modulation, designed to be acoustically opaque. In practice, it sounded like the end of the world, and the end of the world, apparently, sounded like an enormous chord being played by someone who had studied every piece of music ever written and was playing all of it simultaneously. The Vrakther hit its own chord at exactly the same moment. What followed was not an explosion, or at least not a conventional one. The two sound events collided in the air above the venue and produced something Keith had no frame of reference for. A visible standing wave, a shimmering wall of interference that hung in the air like a curtain for approximately 4 seconds before both sound sources' waveforms collapsed into each other and produced a silence so complete that Keith could hear his own heartbeat. The Vrakther was standing in the middle of the stage. Its instrument had gone dark. The faint luminescence that had always played through the crystalline strings was gone. Extinguished. Preacher looked at its hands. It looked at the instrument. It played a single string. Nothing. The air didn't move. The ground didn't tremble. The dampeners still live at 12%, holding on by some miracle of engineering, and Shin's precise calibration registered no signal. Noah said into Keith's ear, voice very controlled and very excited. The acoustic saturation disrupted the quantum harmonic calibration. It can't tune. Keith, it's offline. The Vrakthar tried another string. Then, another. It played what would have been, on a human instrument, a simple chord progression. 3 chords. It played them twice. Softly. Almost tentatively. Silence. It sat down heavily on the stage boards, and the boards creaked under its weight. And it held the instrument in its lap and looked at it for a long time. Keith watched it from behind the barrier. Something in the shape of it. The bowed head, the instrument held carefully in hands too large for it, hit him in a place he hadn't expected. Do we do? Okafor asked quietly beside him. He thought about that. He thought about a creature that had crossed whatever distance it had crossed, had come to a concert venue on a Tuesday, had waited for an audience. He thought about 3,000 tickets. He thought about Lim's pick, still in his jacket pocket. He thought about the fact that this was the moment in every story where you finished it off. Weapon down. Enemy vulnerable. Window of opportunity. Every operational doctrine he'd ever been trained in agreed on this point, with the comfortable unanimity of things that were true until they weren't. We wait, he said. Keith. We wait. They waited for 3 hours. The Vrakthar sat on the stage. Some of the soldiers rotated out to the command vehicle. 8 came back. Shin and Noah ran diagnostics on the speaker array. Okafor sat on a crate near the barrier, with her rifle across her knees, and her eyes on the stage, and the absolute focused patience of a woman who had waited out things far worse than this. Damaris said nothing, which from Thamaris was a form of permission. At some point in the second hour, Preacher began to play again. Quietly. Whatever damage the saturation event had done to the instrument's amplification, it hadn't damaged its basic function. The strings still made sound, just not the sound, not the weapon, music. Low and strange and structured in ways Keith couldn't follow, built on intervals that didn't resolve the way he expected them to, that landed in unexpected places and stayed there comfortable with their own strangeness. He was not a music person. He'd grown up in a house with a radio that was always tuned to one of 2 stations, and a father who thought of music as something you listened to while doing something else. But he found himself listening, not analyzing it, not assessing it. Just listening. Okafor was listening too. Tell by the way her posture had changed. Still alert, still professional, but differently placed. Noah had his tablet down. Nobody spoke. The Vrakthar played for 40 minutes. And then it stopped. And there was the silence of a performance ending, rather than a threat subsiding. Keith was learning. Entirely different silences. The creature looked out at them over the barrier. Keith stepped out from behind it again. He wasn't sure why. It felt like the right thing, which was the kind of reasoning he usually distrusted, but was finding harder to dismiss. He walked to the halfway point. He stopped. The Vrakthar watched him. He reached into his jacket and took out the pick again. He held it up. Then, with the sense of doing something he didn't fully understand and was doing anyway, he walked to the edge of the stage and set it down on the boards. The creature looked at it. Keith walked back. The Vrakthar reached out one enormous hand and picked up the piece of plastic with a delicacy that seemed impossible given the size of its fingers, and held it up to the late light and turned it over. Then it set it down beside the instrument and looked at Keith for a long moment. Then it took the instrument. It lifted it to a performance position, the real one, the one that had stopped his heart 7 years ago. Every person behind the barrier tensed. Keith felt rather than heard the safety catches coming off rifles. The creature played a chord, quiet, a single chord, not the weapon chord, not the subaudible assault that reached into tissue and squeezed, just a chord. 3 notes held, ringing in the cold air over an empty concert venue in Denver. It rang for a long time. Then it was done. Vrakthar slung the instrument across its back. It looked at the pick on the stage boards one more time. It stood. It went up, the way it had come down, the air displacing and shimmering around it, and it was gone. Deep Brief took 11 hours and accomplished approximately what debriefs always accomplished, which was the construction of a coherent narrative around events that had not been coherent while they were happening. Keith sat through it and answered questions, and kept most of his thoughts to himself, which was also what debriefs were for. Afterward, in the parking lot, Noah found him. "The spectrographic analysis of the final chord," Noah said. "I've been running it. What did you find?" "Nothing dangerous. No tissue-resonant frequencies, no amplitude in the hazardous range." It was. He paused, consulting something in his head. Acoustically, it was a very ordinary chord. A minor triad. Basically a C minor, accounting for the alien instrument's different tuning. Musically, it's associated with grief, mourning. Beethoven used it for his Pathetique Sonata. Brahms. A lot of composers, actually, when they wanted to communicate. Noah stopped. He looked at Keith. Loss. Keith thought about the creature on the stage with the inert instrument in its lap. About the way it had held it. 3,000 tickets, he said. "Yeah, it came here to play for people. Yeah, and we stopped it." Noah didn't answer that. Keith put his hands in his jacket pockets and found them empty, and remembered the pick on the stage boards, and thought about Lim again, and about the things you carry for 7 years, and what it means when you finally put them down. "What happens when it comes back?" he asked. Noah considered the question seriously, which Keith had come to expect from him. "I don't know. We disrupted the instrument. It'll recalibrate, probably. The quantum harmonic system is self-repairing, based on the data. Next time the dampeners won't be enough. Next time we'll need a different approach." "What kind of approach?" Keith looked at the empty stage. The boards were cracked where the Vrakthar had landed. The speaker stacks were still in place, wires trailing. Somewhere on those boards was a small piece of plastic that had crossed 7 years and a Nevada desert, and the end of a very strange day to reach a very strange hand. "I don't know yet," he said, something louder. He drove back to his hotel alone. He didn't call anyone. He sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning products, and watched the curtains in the air conditioning draft, and thought about what it would mean to build a thing instead of break one. Somewhere out there, an instrument was recalibrating, finding its frequency again, learning from what had happened, the way adaptive systems do, the way everything that survives long enough to try again eventually does. He thought about Lim playing guitar in a garage in Omaha. He'd heard about it, secondhand, never seen it. Someone who knew Lim had told him once that he'd played like he meant it, which was the best thing you could say about how anyone played anything. He thought about 3,000 people in a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon, with nothing more dangerous than portable speakers and a desire to be somewhere music was happening. He pulled out his phone and called Noah. "I need the spectrographic data," he said. "All of it. The Nevada recordings, today's readings, everything." "What are you looking for?" "I don't know yet. But we've been thinking about this the wrong way. Been trying to stop it from playing. What if instead," he paused, "what if we played back?" The silence on the phone had a different quality than the silence after the chord, but it was in the same family. The silence of something being reconsidered, of a map being redrawn. "Keith," Noah said slowly, "that would require, produce a responsive signal at the right frequency range, calibrated to whatever it transmits we'd need. Can it be done?" A long pause. The kind that meant yes. "It's going to take a while," Noah said. "We have time." Keith looked at the curtains moving in the draft. "It'll be back. They always come back." 6 months later, on another Tuesday, because of course it was a Tuesday, the Vrakthar descended into a field outside Flagstaff, Arizona, in the early evening, when the light was going orange and red over the mountains. This time there was no crowd to evacuate. This time there was no perimeter, no barriers, no speaker stacks deployed by forklift. There was Keith, standing in a field with a rig that Noah had spent 6 months building and worrying over. A device the size and shape of a guitar amplifier that contained, as Noah had described it, more computational power than I'm comfortable telling you about, and a speaker array that technically shouldn't be able to produce half the frequencies it produces. The Vrakthar landed 50 meters away. It looked at him. He looked at it. It unslung the instrument. Not to the performance position, just held it, in the way of something that hadn't decided yet. Keith reached over and turned on the rig. Came out of it was the C minor chord. Not a reproduction, not a recording. Noah had spent 6 months reverse engineering the spectral signature of what the Vrakthar had played in Denver and rebuilding it from the outside in. Finding the intervals that weren't quite human, the tuning that was approximately a semitone off from anything in the Western system, the specific resonance of an instrument built from bone and starlight by hands that didn't think the way human hands thought. It was approximate. It was rough around the edges. It was in all likelihood the equivalent of someone attempting to speak a language from a phrasebook and producing something that was technically the right words in an accent that made a native speaker wince. But it was the chord. The Vrakthar went absolutely still. For a moment Keith thought he'd made a mistake, that he'd miscalculated, that this was going to end the way Tuesday things ended. And he found himself in peace with that in the rapid and unromantic way of a man who had done it before. Then the creature lifted its instrument to the performance position and played back. Not the weapon chord, not the assault frequency, chord it had played at the end of Denver, the C minor, the minor triad, the one Beethoven used for grief. But different now, an answer, not a restatement. The way musicians answer each other across the space of a song, picking up a theme and turning it, finding what's on the other side of it. Keith listened to it, ring through the orange evening air. Then he reached over to the rig and played the next chord in the sequence Noah had mapped out. The relative major, E-flat, the way the minor resolves sometimes. Not into happiness exactly, into something steadier. The Vrakthar was quiet for a moment. Then it played it back, its version, its understanding of what he was reaching toward. They played for 40 minutes in a field, outside Flagstaff as the sun went down. Keith, with his 6 months of crash course music theory and a rig that technically shouldn't work, and the Vrakthar, with an instrument made of starlight that had crossed distances he couldn't calculate to care. They weren't playing the same thing. They were playing toward the same thing, which was different, and in some ways harder, and in some ways the point. At some point, Keith stopped thinking about what he was doing and just did it, which was, he supposed, the only way anyone ever learned anything. When it was over, when they both, somehow without discussing it, arrived at the same moment of stopping. The Vrakthar sat on the ground and put the instrument across its knees and looked at Keith with its copper eyes in the last of the light. He sat down too. His back hurt, and his ear was ringing, the old bruise from Nevada complaining about the frequency exposure, and the field was cold and smelled like sage and dust. He put his hands in his pockets and found them empty and realized he'd put down the last thing he'd been carrying. That felt right. Okay, he said aloud to no one or anyone. The Vrakthar made a sound he hadn't heard from it before. Low, rhythmic, through its chest cavity. It took him a moment to identify it. It was laughing, or the closest thing to laughing that crossed the distance between them. He laughed too, briefly, quietly, the way you laughed when something is funny, in the exact way you hadn't expected. They sat in the field until the stars came out, which in Arizona came out all at once, immediately, like they'd been waiting. Then the Vrakthar stood and slung the instrument and went up into those stars. Keith sat for a while longer. Then he took out his phone and called Noah. It worked, he said. I know, Noah said. I was watching the spectral feed, Keith. What you two were doing at the end, the last 20 minutes. That wasn't the script I wrote. No. Where did that come from? He thought about it. He thought about a garage in Omaha, and a pick in the dust, and a concert venue in Denver, and a Tuesday in Nevada. He thought about the way the C minor had sounded hanging in the cold air, and something that wasn't quite grief at the same time. The way music was always both things at once. Don't know, he said. Just played. He hung up and looked at the stars and thought about the next Tuesday, and the one after that, and what it meant to build a conversation instead of ending one. In his experience, those took longer. They were harder to debrief. They didn't produce the kind of clear outcome that looked good in reports. They produced the kind of outcome that let you sit in a field in Arizona in the dark and feel like something had gone right for once. He got up. His back creaked. He picked up the rig, which was heavier than it looked. He walked back to his truck, and the field was dark behind him, and somewhere above the stars, something ancient and strange, was making its way home through the spaces, between things, carrying a cord that had not existed until tonight, built from what two very different kinds of hands could find when they reached toward the same place that felt like enough, that felt like exactly enough.